Michelangelo was quite a character, and we can actually see shades of who he was, particularly in the Sistine Chapel ceiling and probably in the tomb and stuff like that. Paul Gauguin hung out with also a colorful cast of characters himself and was one himself. For instance, he was roommates with Van Gogh, and that was probably a really intense experience. He really hung out with uh, Edward Manet, Paul Cézanne, Camille Pissarro, Claude Monet, and he also had an interesting past. And the high points of his past are he spent some time as a child in Peru, in Lima, and he moves back to France with his family. He was born in France originally, and then he ends up becoming a merchant marine. And so this is a sort of macho kind of guy who's a world traveler and really saw his own roots as being sort of primitive and powerful. Then he gets a job as a stockbroker, which doesn't sound so in keeping with the character that I, um, thought about. But basically, he starts seeing art while he's a stockbroker and becomes interested in it. And then there's a stock market crash and he loses his job. And he was one of those people who did paint. He was sort of a Sunday painter. And then when he lost his job, he wanted to do it full time. And the story basically is that he left his wife and children behind, and he set out on his own. So early in his career, he travels around. He lives in Paris for a while. He lives in some quieter areas, and he moves to Arles with Van Gogh at one point. And that is a disaster socially and also in terms of, well, he gets a lot of work done, but Van Gogh just comes out of it nuttier than ever. And then what he ends up doing is something that I think is really kind of creepy. He moves to Tahiti, which is in French Polynesia, and I don't think that basically his moving to Tahiti is such a terrible thing. But what he did there and how he lived, he decided he was going to live sort of like a savage, and he's married, remember, as a child, and I think he was Catholic, and you're not allowed to get divorced if you're Catholic. And then he moves to Tahiti and he gets himself a 15-year-old girlfriend. So let's start first by kind of looking at his biography in terms of how his painting relates to it. And I think you can first see that this painting by Paul Gauguin um, is a painting of Vincent van Gogh painting some sunflowers. And I've given you the image of the sunflowers on the left that he's painting. If you remember from the Van Gogh lecture, basically Theo Van Gogh asked Gauguin to come to Arles where Vincent was living and found this sort of little artist community. And it was only just the two of them. And I know that Vincent was probably a little too into Gauguin and a little too excited, and there's a story in which he paints a whole room of sunflowers, and Gauguin gets there and sees this, and he's really impressed, he's really honored, but at the same time it's kind of a weird thing. And what eventually happens is they are painting together and they're sort of feeding off of each other. And you can see in this painting on the right hand side that there are flattened out forms. There's a lot of non-local color involved there. But he doesn't use a lot of texture like Vincent does. And a point is made of that in the movie Lust for Life, where they sort of argue about how the paint should be textured and thick, or should it be thin and loose and that kind of thing. But I think overall there are similarities in the flattened out Japanese-like design of the paintings. And I also think that the use of non-local colors and sort of, in some ways, the negation of perspective tie in with this. While he's in the countryside, he looks at the sort of they're a group of Amish people in a way. They're not actually Amish, but there were people who lived in the countryside and lived a very Amish type of life, who were very close to the book, and also believed that technology wasn't such a good thing and that they should be very conservative. And so he lives with these people and he views them sort of as almost primitive people who are somehow more superstitious than he is, and not as modern as the Parisians. And I think what he takes away from that is he gets this conception that these people are purer than him and have a direct line to God and a direct connection to God. So what happens then is he decides he's going to start making paintings of them. And this painting, The Vision After the Sermon, is a story out of the Old Testament in which Jacob, after stealing his brother Esau's birthright, um, is about to come back to the fold and make things up with Esau. And he's traveling back, and he's already, he's become very wealthy, and he's sent things ahead. And as he gets there, he meets this guy on the road, and it's not very clear in the Bible, but the traditional interpretation of it is that the angel Michael met up with him on the road, and for some reason, Jacob and Michael wrestle all night, and in the process, Jacob gets renamed Israel, and he also receives a blessing because the angel and he are kind of at a stalemate, and so the angel blesses him, and then he goes on his way back home. And the traditional Christian and Catholic, and I suppose Protestant understanding of this story is that it's a type of story that relates to the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus, in which there's a forgiveness after winning, after doing good deeds and winning some sort of virtue, and that Jacob is sort of a type of person in the Old Testament that relates to Jesus, at least in terms of teaching forgiveness and how families should stay together, that kind of thing. And in Vision After the Sermon, what I think Gauguin is showing you is that these women who are traditional Normandy women who are wearing the traditional clothing, which is contemporary clothing pretty much to Gauguin, and they actually have a vision of the story of Jacob wrestling the angel out on a lawn, and they feel that they have directly had a experience or a mystical experience in which they understand the sermon that was given inside and the passage out of the Bible that they read. And the way that Gauguin kind of expresses this spirituality, at least for him, I'm not sure if I feel this way, is that he believed that you could use color and painting to be a sort of prophet and to sort of push some sort of spiritual button. And he believed in some ways that he was a symbolist. And he referred to himself as a nabi, and I think it's spelled Nabis, which is basically prophet in Hebrew. And so what he was trying to do is the non-local color is what the emotion and the energy feel like. And his use of sort of flattened out spaces and these women looking at the angel with these big sort of yellow golden wings is a depiction of that kind of energy or spirit. I suppose that's open to debate, and I'm going to argue in some ways that Gauguin is not such a great guy as a human being, even though he keeps talking about religion in his paintings. The argument against against Gauguin as being a good guy, I suppose, comes from my own sense of values, in which here he is, this family man who's a stockbroker, and yeah, he lost his job, but go get another one. And so he becomes a painter, and he basically ditches his wife and kids. And that doesn't seem like a very nice thing to do. And so then he, after doing these sort of nasty things, at one point it's possible that Gauguin got into a lot of bar fights and actually might have even cut Vincent van Gogh's ear, because he was an expert swordsman. And then he moves to Tahiti, and he ends up getting involved with the people who live there, the actual Aboriginal people or native people, and he takes on a lover who's a 15-year-old girl. And all the while that this is going on, he's looking at these women as if they are pure in spirit. And so I wonder if they're so pure in spirit, why he had to have sex with them or defile them in that way if he has these Christian values. But he sees them living in a sort of modern Eden, that they've never been touched by European religion or spirituality, and that they are pure spirits in the most primitive sense. This is going to tie in a little bit with what Picasso talks about in terms of the myth of primitivism, that he believes primitive art is more pure in some ways. In any event, so the title of this in Polynesian is We Hail Thee Mary, Ia Orana Maria, and that the woman on the right-hand side is sort of the Virgin Mary, and that's her Christ child on the shoulder. For an Enlightenment period, it's very interesting how many people make so many sort of religious paintings at the time. And we see this Garden of Eden behind, and he paints it in a very flat, diagrammatic way. I suspect that it's because he couldn't draw, and he was sort of a self-taught artist, and that he didn't really have a handle on anatomy, so he solved visual problems any way that he could. But this is his naive way of drawing appeals to people, and he also flattened out forms and didn't really work with traditional perspective. And he probably got some of those lessons, but he chose to go primitive and draw almost like in a childlike way, almost in a savage way. And he thinks that in some ways he's getting more in touch with some basic spiritual kind of essence by doing that. Paul Gauguin's Spirit of the Dead Watching is a painting of his girlfriend, who is, just a young woman, probably just post-adolescent or maybe even adolescent. And he's looking at her obviously for visual pleasure. And there is this specter standing behind the bed as she's looking over at the painter. There's a specter looking at her, and it has a bit of Polynesian writing, Manao Tapapau. Obviously, I didn't say that correctly, but basically, it means the spirit of the dead watching. And what she, in her primitive way, and I say this in a sarcastic way because I don't see those people as being primitive. Um, Gauguin believed that her sense of spirituality was so close to that the walls between the spirit world and her world were so thin that this was a specter of her ancestors who was always following her and watching over her, and that in a way it's sort of like, it's not necessarily a menacing thing. I think it's actually the idea that sometimes people feel when someone dies that the person who died became a guardian angel, and that sometimes can be a grandparent or a parent. And I think that that's what's being expressed here. The textures in the background are a little different than the textures in the foreground, the way that it's painted. It's almost like he is playing with paint quality in the background there. And as you move forward, he flattens out the forms and he uses some traditional Polynesian prints, and doesn't do a lot of modeling of value of tone. And really, in the whole painting, there's no attention to chiaroscuro or shading. It's really about flattened diagrammatic forms that are almost cartoon-like, and probably influenced in some way by Polynesian carving, that he felt that that blocky caricature style really communicated things very well for him. Now, as a side issue, and relating this to the Orientalist works of art, in my class we did a reading by a brilliant scholar named Linda Nochlin, and the article was entitled The Imaginary Orient. It's in a collection of essays for her. If you email me, I'll send it to you. And what she discusses, this art historian Linda Nochlin discusses, is the idea that Europeans go to these sort of exotic foreign places that they see as somehow primitive, and they exploit the resources that are there. and they tend to portray that culture in a way that's not necessarily realistic to what actually is happening there. It's not a true objective point of view. It's basically an interpretation of the point of view. So for instance, in this painting on the left hand side, that's a harem scene, but there's a lot of weird stuff visually going on if that's a so-called odalisque, which is a Turkish harem girl. And the most glaring thing is her white skin. Now I know that there were probably white slaves at that point in time, but in almost all of Eng's paintings, the main object of desire has extremely white European features and a white European body, and that there's this sort of hierarchy where you have a slightly darker skinned person who is a female who's serenading her, and then a eunuch who's standing behind the banister way in the background, and he happens to be Moorish, which means he's African in descent and has very dark pigment. Um, and this is supposed to seem almost like a realistic scene and that this could really happen, but this never really happened. And I think that Paul Gauguin is doing the same thing.
Horch, horch! Es flüstert zwischen Bäumen und exotischen Pflanzen und rosa Blüten. Welches Märchen uns hier wohl erzählt wird? Alles scheint still zu sein, und doch scheint auf dem Bild etwas Unheimliches in leuchtenden Farben vorzugehen. Ist der Mann mit dem brandroten Haar und grellgrünen Augen im linken Bildrand vielleicht ein Geist oder ein Freund der zwei Mädchen? Dieses Geheimnis könntest du vielleicht zusammen mit deinen Eltern an einem Sonntagnachmittag lüften. Denn das Bild hängt ganz in deiner Nähe im Museum Volkwang in Essen. Gauguin sehnte sich nach dem Einklang mit der Natur. Für ihn war die ferne Insel Tahiti noch einer dieser ursprünglichen Orte. Darum ist er auf diese Insel ausgewandert. Er meinte dort, wie in guten alten Zeiten, ohne Stadtlärm und Industrie leben zu können. Aber natürlich wollten auch die Bewohner von Tahiti die vielen praktischen Erfindungen nutzen, und Gauguin fand so kein wirkliches Paradies vor. Kurzum malte er das Tahiti, das er sich erträumt hatte. Eine exotische Welt voller geheimnisvoller Geschichten, in